And welcome back. While New York City has made significant strides in reducing its emission from city-owned buildings, the progress has been uneven, as the Bronx has lagged considerably behind in its peer boroughs in emission reductions. A new analysis by the Center for an Urban Future reveals that while the intensity of greenhouse gas emissions from city-owned buildings has decreased 9.6% since 2014, 8 of the 25 city agencies have experienced emissions increases. Joining me now is the Editorial and Policy Director of the Center for an Urban Future, Eli Dvorkin. And Eli, good to have you.
Hey, great to be back with you, Daren. Thanks for having me on.
Glad to have you. And yeah, well, I'm glad to talk about this because when we talk about this here, as I said, New York City, okay, we're doing. But when it comes to the Bronx, not so well. First and foremost, why do you think the Bronx is lagging behind?
Well, Daren, I almost hate to answer that question because unfortunately the answer is the Bronx has frequently been left behind in many issues, but especially when it comes to environmental issues. We all know, but I think it bears repeating that the Bronx has really borne the brunt of so many of the negative impacts of pollution, of climate change, and those impacts persist to this day. We know that Bronx residents are about 70% more likely than other New York City residents to suffer from hospitalization as a result of asthma. We know that Bronx residents in the West Bronx are over 200% more likely to be exposed to dangerous levels of particulate matter than other New York City residents. And years of policy decisions led to this place, whether it was the construction of highways in residential neighborhoods or locating power plants and other city facilities or state-run facilities that produce pollution and other emissions in the Bronx. Now, fortunately, that is starting to change. We've seen a new level of investment coming into the Bronx to help mitigate decades of underinvestment, decades and more of policies that have led to really severe environmental consequences for Bronx residents. But we're still seeing today that the pace of investment just isn't sufficient to put the Bronx where it needs to be. And as our report shows, when you look at the really important reductions in greenhouse gas emissions among city-owned buildings that the city's been able to achieve, over the past decade or so, the Bronx unfortunately comes in last of all 5 boroughs. It's still seen a reduction, but that reduction, about 7.4%, is lower than any of the other 4 boroughs, and that needs to change.
Yeah. So when we look at your study, you took time to take a look at this. Walk us through how the study took place and how this all came about.
Sure, thanks, Daren. So just a little bit of the context up front. I mean, first of all, as you mentioned earlier, the city is making significant strides, major efforts to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The far-reaching Local Law 97, passed a couple of years ago, imposes these really ambitious emissions caps on privately owned buildings, office buildings, residential buildings. But the city itself, as a landlord, has a really important role to play as well. In fact, New York City, the city of New York, is the city's largest landlord. So even as the city pushes and pulls the private sector to make more progress, the city's got to make more progress of its own. The good news here is that some of that progress is showing up in the data. We've looked at about 1,600 city-owned buildings that the city's Department of Finance tracks every year. And we did find an overall emissions reduction of about 9.6%. That gets the city maybe just on pace to meet these incredibly important but ambitious goals of an 80% reduction in emissions, over the next 10 years or so. But in order to reach that goal, to hit those numbers by 2030, a lot more progress is going to need to happen. And that means focusing on the parts of the city-owned building stock where not enough progress has been made. So our analysis, which just looks at some of this data, it doesn't dive into all of the causes and the needs, but we can see pretty clearly a couple of areas where more focus is needed. A big one is obviously the Bronx, coming in dead last of the 5 boroughs in terms of the reduction from city-owned buildings, but also CUNY in particular. CUNY is the largest number of buildings of any agency or government entity in the report, and yet it saw a significant, to see significant building emissions increase. And that's really concerning. CUNY is a major component of the city's overall building stock, and we're going the wrong direction there. So between focusing on the agencies where we're either not making enough progress or we're actually slipping the wrong direction, like CUNY, as well as focusing on the parts of the city like the Bronx that are lagging behind, that's where the city should really redouble their efforts so that those ambitious emissions reductions goals can be met, and ultimately so that we can make a city that's more sustainable and resilient for the long term.
Walk me back to CUNY for a minute. I mean, that was a number that was pretty startling for me. We know that they are one of the largest landowners right here in the borough of the Bronx, but then the trend goes upward. And it's not a good sign. Is there any particular reason that we can attribute to why instead of a downward?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, first of all, just considering how difficult a challenge this is for CUNY and by extension for city and state leaders, CUNY has an incredibly old building stock, and the Bronx in particular. I mean, looking at Bronx Community College, the average building at BCC is 80 years old. I mean, these are buildings that were built for a completely different era. They were built to be run on oil, fuel. They don't have anything close to the level of insulation of modern buildings. Now, there's been some small signs of progress there, but the reality is CUNY can't do this on its own. CUNY is so totally dependent on state dollars in particular to fund a capital program for the senior colleges. And Lehman College in the Bronx also has real challenges with improving the energy efficiency of its buildings. And the city plays the lead role in capital funding for CUNY's community colleges. And in both cases, while funding has increased, it's just not enough to even keep pace with the state of good repair needs at CUNY. We're talking about even more basic things, fixing problems with roofing systems before they cause leaks, or HVAC systems so that there's sufficient heat in the winter. These are basics. We're talking about a lot of infrastructure needs every year just to keep the lights on, keep buildings open and accessible and functional for students and teachers. That doesn't even get us to the level of investment needed to retrofit buildings, to run on greener energy systems, to electrify buildings at scale. That's a huge undertaking, to be able to insulate these aging buildings, or in some cases to rebuild systems that just aren't made for the kinds of energy efficiency reductions that we're seeking right now. So between the basic needs to keep CUNY in a state of good repair and the billions of additional dollars needed to be able to truly retrofit CUNY to become a green and sustainable higher education system for the future, that requires a new level of investment at the city and state level. CUNY just can't do that on its own.
Yeah, and I look here and I'm saying to myself that I know these buildings are very old. I mean, we're in one of that's where our studio is held, right? Lehman College. We know that some of these buildings are really facing the need for new construction, but dependent on dollars in order to make this happen. And sometimes, if the dollars aren't coming from the state to be able to create not new housing, but new buildings and administrative wings and things of that nature, you can really get caught behind.
Yeah, absolutely true. And, I think in so many cases, we've seen that challenge playing out across CUNY, but also other key elements of the city's infrastructure. I see the same things happening with the city's 3 public library systems, for example, which have also been able to actually make progress on reducing emissions, although, again, unevenly. But the reality is that so many of these institutions, from libraries to schools to CUNY, they're just not able to even keep pace with these basic maintenance needs, let alone invest in these building upgrades, retrofits, and systems of the future. So, part of the challenge here is that it's been difficult to make enough of a strong enough case for just these basic investments, let alone to say, hey, we need to go beyond funding or even struggling to keep pace with these immediate needs to be able to plan long-term for these major reductions in emissions. And that's over a longer period of time, going back 20 years, where enrollment's really increased at CUNY. It's been flatter over the past few years, but we've seen that, compared to 20 years ago, the number of students enrolled at Bronx Community College, has almost doubled. So there's a much greater demand than there was 20, 25 years ago, let alone, 80 years ago when many of these campuses were created. And yet, just keeping those basic systems functioning is already draining the capital dollars that are allocated every year, let alone making these really generational investments in changing these systems for the long term.
I hear a lot of talk nowadays about climate change and, the work that's going on live in Washington, D.C. as we speak, really trying to address the matter, talking about the impact that it's actually having nationwide. Let's localize this for a minute. Take us down to New York City, more specifically the borough of the Bronx. Give me a little bit of insight as to how climate change is really impacting the borough of the Bronx.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many ways in which not only is climate change impacting the Bronx, but it's disproportionately impacting the Bronx. And we've seen this for years. One of the most powerful examples is just looking at the effects of heat in the Bronx. Lack of tree cover, for instance, leads to higher temperatures on the ground. That causes health incidents every single year, causes deaths, hundreds of deaths every single year in the Bronx. And just mitigating the heat island effect specifically in the Bronx could save the city tens of millions of dollars in health costs, and more importantly, save lives. So that's a little sense of the kind of the need out there. But obviously, as the planet warms, as New York City warms along with it, that impact isn't felt equally everywhere. It disproportionately affects those communities that don't have the tree cover, where there's already been decades of underinvestment in preparing for some of these effects, and we see that play out every summer, unfortunately. We also see this in terms of more powerful and unpredictable storms. We see the effects of flooding increasing in the city, and even for a borough as hilly as the Bronx, we see that all across, on coastal areas and on low-lying areas. And we also know that there's a real challenge here when it comes to making sure that that Bronx residents feel like New York City government understands their needs, because these problems didn't just start overnight. This isn't just a fact that, oh, the planet's now suddenly warming faster than it was previously. We're really talking about decades of underinvestment in public health and in environmental justice in the Bronx that have led us to a point where every fraction of a degree that the planet warms, it harms communities in the Bronx more than other parts of the city. Now, there's other places in New York City that are also disproportionately vulnerable, but that consistently means looking at communities where there hasn't been that level of investment to date, whether it's in green infrastructure and alleviating the effects of storm water runoff and drainage systems, or increasing tree cover to lower surface temperatures, or getting those particulates out of the air that are causing a disproportionate number of children every single year, every single decade in the Bronx to be hospitalized with asthma attacks compared to their peers in wealthier communities. So we really see that this problem didn't just begin, but the solutions start now. And one of the most important ways that the city government, can make additional progress here is starting with their own house, and that is the more than 1,800 buildings that the city owns, where significant reductions in emissions can make for cleaner air, can help to mitigate some of the warming effects of climate change, and ultimately can start to undo some of the damage that we've seen disproportionately affecting parts of the city like South Bronx.
Yeah. We were talking in the last segment about a couple of segments ago about affordable housing and the fact that there's so much housing, and the mayor has this new blueprint for housing, and how we're seeing new development coming up, new buildings being built. But with the emergence of these new buildings, these new structures going up, do you think that this is advantageous in terms of really helping to reduce emissions, given the fact that you have to have some new codes, some new requirements?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, Darren. I mean, certainly it's not my area of expertise, but I could say, first of all, we know that there's such a housing crisis in New York City right now for renters. We've seen that median asking rents have skyrocketed over just the past few months, and it doesn't show any signs of being alleviated. And we know that adding supply is only part of the answer, but it's obviously a really important part. New York City just has not built enough housing for decades now to account for population growth and the number of people that want to be here. So we do need to be building new housing, and the Bronx absolutely can benefit from that. In doing so, I think there's the advantage now of what will be coming online through the regulations created through Local Law 97. Well, this can help to ensure that more of that new housing is being built at a level that can really make a difference in terms of the energy efficiency of those buildings. And older buildings obviously tend to be much less energy efficient, completely uninsulated in some cases, built around fossil fuels. So there's a real opportunity there. And at the same time, there's a cost that comes with obviously any new construction. That does require energy, that does require carbon to be emitted. But I think when you look at it on the balance, being able to build much more energy efficient structures, as well as alleviating the city's, starting to really make more progress in alleviating the city's enormous housing crisis, these are things that together can actually start to make some real improvements in the Bronx, and especially in areas where the housing stock is mostly a century old. And it's almost impossible to retrofit your way into the level of efficiency that I think is going to really make a difference. In some cases, these new buildings are really going to be a significant improvement. So doesn't mean you stop retrofitting. On the contrary, there's an equal, if not even greater need from a climate change perspective to help far more Bronx residents, small landlords, homeowners as well, to be able to retrofit their buildings and ensure that they can maintain the requirements of Local Law 97. And that only applies to larger buildings. There's a lot of smaller buildings out there, especially in the Bronx, that aren't subject to that regulation, but it means that they may not be making much progress there. Still burning oil, for instance, certainly many, many homes still heated and fueled by gas. So making those transitions rapidly is incredibly important as well, but building new housing in particular with a much greater degree of energy efficiency and ideally electrifying their building systems, that's going to make a big difference too.
So when we talk about 2050, that's the time that we're looking to see this to actually be zero emissions. How much are we on the timeline to possibly get there? I mean, I know it's still early to tell, but we still should be able to take a gauge as to what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's tough to answer, but certainly this report gives us a little bit of insight into that. We know that this ambition, but it's essential for the city's future, frankly, for the planet's future. I'm optimistic that that certainly the initial goal is within reach. We want to get to a place where we see a significant reduction by 2030 on the road to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. With the current pace that we're seeing, we're just about there. Looking at that 9%, 9.6% decrease since 2014, that sets the city up to be just on pace to be able to reach its initial goals, its 2030 goals. But there's no wiggle room. There's no room for error there. So I think the really important takeaway for me is we've already seen some of the major gains or reductions rather in building emissions that have been achieved by 2014. Those are terrific. They need to be maintained, but there may not be a lot more room for some of those buildings to improve. So that really means we saw this 9.6% decrease in 2014. How do we replicate that every 5 years to reach these goals? That's what we need to do. And then some. We need to be achieving that level of reduction every 5 years. That means we have to focus on these buildings and these parts of the city that either are falling behind that level of progress, or as with many of these CUNY buildings and other buildings in the Bronx, they're actually trending the wrong direction. If the city can make the same amount of progress in these other areas that are falling behind, I actually do think the city can reach its goals, but it's going to take everything it has to reach that.
Yeah. Before we wrap, how do people get their hands on this report?
Thanks so much, Daren. Yes, nycfuture.org is where all of our research is published. Everything is there for free for anyone to read and digest and explore. And feel free to reach out to any of us at the center. Our contact information is there as well.
All right. Eli Dvorkin, as always, a pleasure. We'll check back with you and find out how we're progressing or regressing.
Thank you so much, Daren. Always a pleasure to be with you.